In our last discussion, we were talking about Carl Jung. And as you read Jung, you will find that there's a certain amount of mystery in his theory. And that mystery sometimes makes reading the theory difficult because so many complexities are introduced. You may remember even my saying to you, there's a certain obsessive quality to this theory, but it's because he really wanted to help people to understand how intricate any theory of personality has to be if it's really going to deal with the complexities of human beings. Now, his style in therapy was a little different, and we just began to talk about what happens when Jungians do psychotherapy. Now, you'll see here in one of our slides that there were 4 stages that take place in Jungian psychotherapy. The first one is called confession. And this is important because it's the beginning phase, and it's where an individual acknowledges his or her conflicts to another person. In some cases, this kind of acknowledgement is really taking place for the first time for this person. And it also enables a patient to acknowledge that he or she has certain weaknesses, and that reliance on a therapist is going to be necessary in order to overcome these weaknesses. Now, normally, if this is effective, that is, if this first stage of confession is effective, the experience is positively cathartic, meaning that real emotion comes out of the person and the person begins to feel safe about letting emotion be expressed. And in Jungian therapy, this is the beginning of transference. Now, if you remember with Freud, we talked about transference, and essentially what happens in transference is as the patient comes in, early in therapy, the therapist essentially, in Freudian therapy, the therapist does almost nothing. In Jungian therapy, the person's a little more active, but it's the patient who talks. And the theory is that as the patient experiences this catharsis, is able to talk, to tell another human being about whatever it is that's troubling that individual, the person begins to idealize the therapist. In fact, the therapist becomes the idealized parent. And the patient projects onto the therapist all of those characteristics that a person really wished their parent had, or their parents had. And so the therapist becomes a very positive figure in the emotional appreciation of the patient. Now, this stage goes on for a while, and remember now, the therapist is probably saying next to nothing. So all of these feelings that are occurring are not occurring because the therapist is doing something that's really actively encouraging the transference, but rather it's the patient. And if you think about it now, the patient has come to see this therapist thinking the therapist will be a good person, thinking the therapist will help them. So it's not unusual that the person would then make a lot of very positive assumptions about the therapist. Now, what happens though is after a period when the patient experiences a sense that the therapist is not doing enough for me, or the patient may begin to feel so positive about the therapist, it begins to frighten the patient that they're having so many feelings. So you get into a period then that's called negative transference. The first part is positive transference. Therapist is only good. Now, when negative transference occurs, the patient is beginning to experience all of those losses or lacks of nurturance that they feel came from their parents. That is, the therapist is not being good enough. The therapist is not doing the things the patient wants. The therapist is not fulfilling, perhaps, very primitive wishes. So what happens at this stage is you'll find that the patient behaves differently. One way, sometimes the safest way, especially for people who have difficulty with anger, is the patient kind of closes down. And the person will say things like, I really don't have anything to talk about today. Or, you know, I've kind of told you everything. There's not much more for me to say. And what you see is the patient ceases to be giving. But the reason the patient ceases to be giving is because the patient is angry that he or she experiences that the therapist is not doing enough. And of course, the therapist actually means that mom and dad did not take care of me, and you, the therapist, are now seemingly behaving like mom and dad. You are not being the nurturing, loving, caring individual that I need. On the other hand, for people who are more expressive of their anger, this may be a period where the patient really begins telling the therapist, I don't know why I see you. I mean, you're really not very good. You don't seem to understand me. You don't say things that are helpful to me. You don't give me ideas about what I should go and do. I'm not any better than I was the day I came here. Those are very kind of common statements that go on during a period of negative transference. But what's important, especially when the person begins voicing this kind of negativity, is that the therapist listens for what is it that this person is feeling he or she is not getting. Becomes an important time because you begin to see, like, what are those areas earlier in life that were not gratified for this person, and now the person is really expressing how angry they are about it. So what happens during this phase, for example, is when a person says, you don't give me enough instruction, you might say to them, what kind of instruction were you hoping for? Do you recall any other time in your life where you felt, you weren't getting enough support or enough instruction, or you weren't getting enough guidance, or someone wasn't taking care of you, and you begin to direct the patient to start associating, and usually in things like this, the patient begins to associate back to parents or back to important adult figures in their life, and so you begin to, during this time, to actually make very productive headway. Now, eventually, as transference is established, the patient begins to surface aspects of the unconscious that the therapist wants to clarify. That is, the therapist wants the patient to kind of get specific. And during the period where you're trying to focus on what are the conflicts, that's the period that's called elucidation. And you'll notice in the graph that we had up, that's the second stage. Now, we might describe this particular stage in psychoanalysis as kind of the stage of insight, where the patient actually begins to understand some of the origins of his or her problem. They've kind of moved beyond all these accusations about how inept the therapist is, and they're beginning to recognize that all of those accusations are really the feelings that they have about not having been cared for, or not having gotten the gratifications or the guidance or whatever it is that was disappointing to them early in their life. That then leads to a stage that we call education. That's the third stage in this model. And at this time, the patient actually begins to try out specific strategies outside of the therapy session. That is, the patient takes what he or she is learning, and they go out into the environment, and they begin to test out things. And so it becomes kind of a trial and error period where an individual is trying to learn new strategies, and it may mean that the person is doing things that generated anxiety before. But they generated anxiety because the patient was confusing the social scene that he or she has in their adult life with the social scene that they experienced at home as a child. And so the person goes out, let's say if it's somebody who didn't feel very important about themselves, and so they've been working very hard. They feel their boss doesn't recognize them. They've been too frightened to ask for a raise. They might actually go out and ask for a raise. And then they would come back and report to the therapist their feelings about having done this. One of the interesting things is that sometimes a person will go and involve themselves in an act like this, and it really doesn't matter whether they get the raise or not. The satisfaction they get out of realizing I don't have to sit there and never tell my boss that actually you should be paying more attention to me. I am doing a good job. I really deserve a raise. And just the very act of trying that out, and by the way, finding out that the boss did not fire them, the boss didn't get angry, the boss may have said, you know, we just can't give any raises right now, but you're right, you really do deserve more. You know, I am sorry, we can't do this. Or the boss may end up saying, actually, you're right, let's talk about a raise. But the important thing is you don't necessarily have to get the actual thing you were after. What becomes important to the patient during this period is that they are trying out behaviors they were frightened to try out, and they're finding out it's not that scary. It's really okay to do this. Now, after the person goes through this, then they arrive at a stage, the fourth stage, that we call transformation. And this is an experience where the relationship between the patient and the therapist leads the patient to kind of trustingly move beyond problems that were originally presented, and the person begins to seek greater self-realization. And this, by the way, was a real contribution on the part of Jung, because Jung understood that a person could be in therapy for reasons more than just resolving whatever were perceived as their neurotic conflicts. That is, a person might be functioning fine and yet want to function even better. That is, want to be more in tune with himself or herself, want to be more aware of their potentiality. And today, by the way, there are a number of people who go into therapy who don't necessarily need therapy. That is, their life is not in chaos, they're not doing it terribly at work, they're not about to get divorced, their children are not delinquents. But some people go in therapy because they have this sense, there's more to me than I appreciate. There is something, I would like to do more. I'm not satisfied with where I'm at in life. And so the process of therapy becomes more focused, as Jung would say, on teleology. That is, where do you want to get? What does the future hold for you? What is it that you want in the future that you feel you kind of can't yet achieve? And that can be very healthy. And a person can learn a lot being in therapy and talking about aspirations and talking about hopes and really reflecting on what is keeping me from doing some of the things that I want to do. And so that's this final stage. Now, there were also distinctions in Jungian therapy. First of all, as I described to you with Freud, the person would be lying down on a couch, head on a pillow, and the therapist would be behind the pillow so that the patient actually doesn't see the therapist. For Jung, it was people sat up. You looked right at the therapist and you talked to the therapist. It was very face-to-face. Also, traditional psychoanalysis was 4, even 5 times a week for an hour each time. Jungian therapy tended to be only once or twice a week for an hour. And Jung did not see that you had to come that frequently. And Jungians after that certainly don't see that you have to come that frequently. Also, in Jungian therapy, and we've already discussed this, but just so you keep it clear, there were 2 techniques used. He used, he used free association. And here's where the therapist would do different things than Freud did. For example, with Freud, you would just, if you're the patient, you would just free associate. But if you remember with Jung would actually stop a person and focus on some very specific material and ask the person to associate further to that. And in other words, the therapist would kind of guide the associations listening very carefully for what kinds of themes keep coming up as we get people to associate to different things. Then there was dream interpretation. And in dream interpretation, which happened very actively for Jung, he saw two phases. One phase occurred when you were, and he thought dreams actually occurred in this sequence also, that you tended to dream mostly about current things. But later you began to dream about bigger scenes. If you remember, we talked about the big picture and how some people will have dreams that have figures from the Middle Ages, are full of color, have all kinds of complexities to them. And here's where Jung felt you were really getting in touch with your own phylogenetic history. And so he would have you talk about whatever this reminds you of, but he would be saying the things that are coming up are not necessarily things that actually have occurred in your own life. They may have occurred in the lives of your ancestors, but they have the power to influence you now. And that's what I mean about his theory being mysterious, because there isn't a way to research this. This is where you really get into a philosophy, almost a theology. That is, you either believe this or you don't. In some cases, by the way, though, in therapy, this actually does happen. In other cases, people don't have these dreams. Now then finally, the contrast between Freud and Jung, as you know, both focused on history. But for Freud, history meant what has happened in your life from birth to now. And maybe even more importantly, what has happened in life in the first few years of life. For Jung, history meant what has happened in your life from generations and generations ago, perhaps back to cave people from whom you descend, all the way through to whatever your aspirations are in the future. So for Jung, when we say history, I mean, we really mean a gigantic history, a very different history than certainly Freud thought of. As a result, then, both of them used dreams, but again, Freud focused on dreams as a way to get at certain content that was in the person's fairly immediate past, that is, in their lifetime. Whereas for Jung, he focused not only on material of your previous life, but material that might go back early in the phylogenetic history, but he also focused in dreams upon things that you might be dreaming about for the future. That is, that was valid, important material. Finally, in terms of the treatment itself, Jung was a much more collaborative therapist than Freud. Jung would talk with the patient. Jung sat there and the patient looked at the therapist, and they were much more highly interactive than you would find in typical Freudian psychoanalysis. Okay, now that kind of takes us, sure.
There are two phases to dream interpretation. I didn't quite get the two phases.
Oh, okay. Sure. One is association. And what happens is the therapist asks the person lots of questions and tries to get the person to give a lot of material that they're reminded of because of the various symbols that are in the dreams. Then the second thing we call amplification. And amplification is the period where you find repetitive themes coming up. And so you begin then to focus on these themes. And you try to amplify each theme and see, like, what material just seems to come up over and over again. The idea being, the more something comes up over and over again, obviously, the more it's probably a core conflict for the person. So that's the second part of that. And you're right, I wasn't clear enough with that. There also is another part of that, and it's called active imagination. And Jung thought active imagination occurred when you really did get into these so-called big dreams. That is, the dreams that are panoramic, that go back generations, that take in multiple people. And he felt if that occurred, and he wanted that to occur, then you really were getting into very, very important material for him. That is, as he would see therapy as then being very successful if you were having those kinds of dreams. Okay. Let's see. Just take me 1 second here. We're going to move to another. There is. We're actually going to move to Alfred Adler. And Alfred Adler was also a person who studied with Freud. His theory comes from, excuse me a second here, and I'll get this thing up, I think. Here we are. Okay. Adler was born about 1870, and he started studying with Freud right after the turn of the century. And while he studied with Freud, why he's noted is because he broke from Freud. And he studied with him for 9 years, and then he broke around 1911. And he really differed from Freud in many ways. And you're going to find when we talk about Adler that here is someone who is much more optimistic about life. Here is someone, it's easier in many respects to listen to him because there really is a very positive sense in his theory. And his theory, by the way, he approached things, and his theory is called holistic. And Adler really gave very little emphasis to Freud's sexual drives and to the idea that you were really driven by these id impulses. So rather, he focused on the idea that man is holistic, that you have a teleological perspective. That is, that you are looking to the future, that you are ambitious for things to happen in your life, rather than constantly struggling on what happened before in your life. He also saw man as being socially oriented. And remember that's quite a break from Freud, because Freud felt that the only reason you were socially oriented is because you needed to not be harmed. That is, you interacted socially in appropriate ways to seek gratification. You'll find that Adler actually thought people really were socially oriented. They actually cared about the people around them. And also Adler was phenomenological. That is, he really believed you should look at a person from the perspective of an individual person. If you want to understand someone, you've got to understand how they feel about themselves, how they look at the world. So the phenomenology of each individual person was very important to Adler. So he called his theory individual psychology. And he actually took it from the Latin meaning indivisible. And by that, what he meant was that true understanding occurs when you take a person in their whole context. And so he felt you couldn't take a person apart. That is, you couldn't break somebody up into a lot of parts and then understand them. And we'll see as we go along with this, by the way, that's a problem. Because, as you know, that's what we've been doing all along. In fact, if you really want to understand someone, you kind of have to, break them up into their parts. And instead, here we have a situation in which someone is saying the only real understanding comes if you see someone in their whole. Now, Adler was really optimistic. He believed that individuals genuinely wished to be productive and that they wanted to do so in a social environment. And he also believed that social factors primarily influenced personality development. And if you take a number of the issues that come up when you think about personality development, you'll see that Adler usually comes down on the very positive side. For example, if you take the philosophical issue of determinism versus free will, what you find is that Adler felt that people have at least sufficient options in their lives so that they can determine where each person is going to end up in the world. So he really felt you are determining where you're going. You are not determined. As to the ethical nature of man, Adler held that man by nature is neither good nor evil, but he has the potentiality for either. So when you are born, you don't start off being good or evil. It's going to be the experiences you have, and especially the experiences you have in the social environment, that's going to determine whether you turn towards being a productive citizen or whether you become a malevolent person. Now, on the mind-body issue, he emphasized the ultimate importance of the mind. And again, giving, and importantly, giving cognitive control to people. On the past-present issue, he emphasized the importance of the present. But for him, his definition of the present was that it included not only what is going on now in your life, but also what you are anticipating in the future. So for him, the idea of present is now, those things that you're conscious of or desirous of now, but also all of your aspirations. And for Adler, it was important for people to recognize that individuals really do look to the future. And actually, sometimes one is really looking to the future for meaning in your life. And that people really are guided in many ways by the expectations you have about what will happen in the future, as well as what is happening right now. Now, on the nature-nurture issue, he focused on the importance of nurture, including man's own ability and creativity to determine the future. So again, this is not someone who is saying you are determined by things that happen right at the beginning of your life. He is saying you have tremendous choices. There are all kinds of things that could happen, but you're going to have to work out your life in a social environment. Now, Adler developed many widely used terms for which he really isn't given the credit he should be given. I mean, people don't know or don't acknowledge that these came from Adler. For example, if you look at our slide, you'll see that inferiority feelings, something that most of us talk about, most of us are very aware of. And what he meant by inferiority feelings is that one feels one does not measure up to society's ideals or perhaps to one's own ideals. So that inferiority feelings could come either because you think the people out there want more of you, you don't measure up, but you could also have inferiority feelings because you have aspirations and you're not realizing those aspirations. Then he also brought up this term, striving for self-esteem. And that's where one takes pride in one's own pursuits and accomplishments. And of course, he saw striving, that is, the idea that you actively were trying to move forward, as being very important. And again, this gives control to you because you are striving for self-esteem, to feel better about yourself. Goal orientation he introduced. And this is an important concept because especially with Freud, of course, you were always looking backwards and you were always trying to learn from your past experiences. He talked about the fact that a very significant part of your life is being oriented to achieving certain goals. And actually that you live your life in many times involving behaviors that will lead you to whatever goal it is that you would like to achieve. And these goals, by the way, will be unique to you. That is, he didn't say there are universal goals that people strive for, he probably would have acknowledged there may be some, but he thought what's important is, what are your goals? What do you really want to become? Then he used the term dependency. Dependency has become so common in all theories that it gets lost. I mean, when did this thing really get introduced? But he saw dependency as a very important variable, and he talked about it, brought it into his theory, and of course talked about the fact that unresolved dependency needs can limit a person as a person moves on in life, because a person may become so fearful, not having been nurtured sufficiently. You'll see as we get on in this theory, by the way, that overprotection was a real concern for him, and that he coined this term and then developed a number of dynamics that he thought that occurred to children who were overprotected. And actually, he saw that as a real limiting force. Actually, he saw it even as one of the things that leads to neurosis later on. So for him, overprotection was not a good thing. And then lifestyle, something that's a very current term. But if you look for who introduced this idea of lifestyle, it really was Alfred Adler. And what he meant by it is that this is an individual's consistent movement toward self-created goals or ideals. And he thought that lifestyle actually started early in life, that children developed goals and aspired to them. And he wanted people to appreciate that these are very strong motivating factors. Now, unlike Freud, in some ways, Adler's theory is much easier to understand, and it certainly has less complexity. However, in a strange way, his lack of complexity makes it difficult to make distinctions that are meaningful that were made in Freud and Jung. So you're going to find at times that you would wish he would make more distinctions. But of course, because he was trying to look at things holistically, he only made those distinctions that he thought were necessary. Now, his theory contained the following components. He said man, like all forms of life, is a unified organism. In stating this, he really strove to emphasize the interactive nature of all parts of the psyche, rather than to split the person, as I've mentioned, most other theorists do. So what he was interested in is not knowing this part, and this part, but rather, how do all of these parts interact? That is you. That is what yourself really is. He also believed that man is endowed with creativity, and thus is self-determined. Now, he knew there were limits. He allowed for the culture and for biological limitations, etc. But he felt that you really do determine your future. You really develop your own personality. You determine who you are. Very different from some of the things we've been talking about. He believed the important factor is not what you're born with, but rather what one makes of one's talents and abilities. So important thing, of course, is to discover your own talents and abilities. And he did make the observation that if you take people who even have similar abilities, that they do not respond to these abilities or to their environment in the same way. So there is an internal choosing process that goes on for people. And so he posited the existence of a creative power with people. And this creative power is what pushed you to examine your abilities. And so you may have abilities similar to another person and yet choose a very different path, because the way in which you envision achieving something might be quite different than someone else, even though both of you could go kind of the same path. Now, consistent then with this approach, Adler felt that important problems that human beings have are not drive satisfaction. That is, you're not trying to resolve conflicts with the id. What he did think is that the important problems in life are behavior towards others, very socially oriented, occupation, and love. Those three things: behavior towards others, occupation, and love. And he saw all of these in a social context. For example, Adler did not see sexuality from the perspective of a sexual drive that required some kind of physiological gratification. In fact, he pointed out, if the only reason that you are going to respond to your sexual drive is to have gratification, you can resolve that with masturbation. So you don't need another person if all you're trying to do is to create self-satisfaction. His focus was on the concept that sexuality creates a situation for two people, usually of differing sexes, but not necessarily, who intimately live and work together and must develop a system of cooperation that is intimate, that is sharing, and that is compromising. And again, that's the idea of the social interaction that he saw, is that there are other people and they become part of how you grow. Okay, now Adler held that man also has an innate aptitude for social interest. You really have an innate aptitude, but it has to be consciously developed. And interesting, he thought the social interest is not quite inborn. Rather, it's more an innate potentiality. It is something that you have, but if you don't do something about it, it doesn't develop. And this formulation allowed Adler to accomplish several things. First, the assumption of an innate positive factor for social living is easy to understand. And it suggests that man is dominated by a positive force. Now, if you think about the development of psychoanalysis, you can see what a change this was. Here's a man saying, you are really dominated by a positive force, that what is going on inside you is good. Then, by conceiving of the social factor initially as a potentiality or as an aptitude, Adler made the concept cognitive. Thus, he gave control to the individual. He was saying that this social factor is something that you can understand. It's something that you can guide. You can determine the direction that you're going to go in. So for him, he turned over control to the individual. So you're not being driven by irrational impulses. Rather, your life is being determined by the choices that you're going to make. And by saying the social disposition must be trained, Adler could account for the observation that under unfavorable conditions, it is often most undeveloped. So while you have this innate potentiality to be social, to grow, to develop your life, if there's lots of trauma and a lot of things go wrong, a person may do very little with it. Then the social interest concept is the key to Adler's theory that people's mental health depends directly on their efforts to contribute to the betterment of the community. Now, what a different concept. I mean, he's saying that your mental health is tied into whether you're actually trying to make this a better world. And if you think back to Freud, who's saying, your mental health is tied to how well are you able to gratify yourself without causing any concern in the community. But the community's good was not important to him. To Adler, it's tremendously important. Now next then, Adler held that activity is, after social interest, the second most important personality trait. This concept quite literally referred to the need in man to be active in determining one's own personal development. Activity created for the individual the opportunity to move towards a healthy life. For example, caring for others. Now, healthy life for him meant you were interpersonally involved. But a healthy life could also be, let's say, becoming a scholar and perhaps contributing to mankind by coming up with new knowledge. But always it was developing something that would be important for the culture. At the same time, he did understand that activity could contribute to an unhealthy life. For example, if you engage in fighting or hostilities or some forms of disruption that are distressing to society, then you've taken this activity in you and you're directing it in a way that will not be productive. Also, Adler believed that one can recognize the development of a person by their productivity. That if you really want to examine, like how mature someone is, take a look at what they're accomplishing. Are they accomplishing things that are good for themselves and for society? In fact, he said, the normal man is an individual who lives in society and whose mode of life is so adapted that whether he actually wants to or not, society derives a certain advantage from his work. So he saw people as so socially oriented that if you're doing anything, even if you're not intending, let's say, to make society better, society will benefit from what you're doing. Now, then he said that social interest and activity, these two variables we've been talking about, imply a two-dimensional personality theory that has a fourfold typology, meaning you have social interest or you don't have it, you have activity or you don't have it, and so these dimensions are dichotomized. And so by doing that then, he described 4 personality types. And you'll see in almost every theory we deal with, personality types become important. Even though Adler is one saying it's hard to divide people up, what he did say is there are different kinds of people that you can describe. So he starts off with what he calls the ruling type. Now this type consists of individuals whose approach to reality shows a more or less dominant or ruling attitude. In other theories, by the way, this will be called the controlling type. Essentially, these are people who manage anxiety by making certain that they always determine what will occur. This is the person who is really driven in a way to be the boss. This is a person who always chooses the restaurant when you go out. This is the person who wants to be sure that in interpersonal relationships, I am in control. As a result, who do you suppose someone like this marries? What kind of person is, okay? Well, really passive person, eh? Somebody who enjoys having somebody else make all the decisions is going to be the person who marries this individual. Now, what do you suppose is the danger in such a relationship? Okay, domestic violence. Okay, so you've chosen the extreme. Also, as I'm trying to pick out people, you are Mr. Gale. Okay, fine, got that. Good example you gave us, because you point out that if you take this to the extreme, where you've got somebody who is very controlling and someone who's very passive, you really have not only the danger for domestic violence, as you point out, but you have the danger that it'll be chronic, because the passive person won't do anything about it. So that's one outcome you could certainly have in this kind of marriage. What else might occur? Sure.
You create a lack of self-esteem on the passive person, the controlling person.
Okay, you'll create a lack of self-esteem in the passive person. That's really true. And actually, what happens is often the passive person doesn't have a lot of self-esteem, and this just keeps that going. So you're correct. You certainly are not going to allow that person to develop much self-esteem. Sure.
I would think that this type of person would have a real problem when something spontaneous happens or when there's a crisis in which they have no control over, like a death or a fire, or something where it wasn't their decision to be in that situation.
Okay. So in this relationship, at least, you're saying the controlling person is going to have a lot of difficulty if anything comes up spontaneously or unexpectedly, or something that by its very nature you can't have control. Okay. What else can happen in this relationship? Sure.
Between the two, I feel maybe there's going to be a lack of communication between them, since only one makes decisions.
Okay, you're saying there's going to be a lack of communication. Maybe in this, it's more that the lack of communication will be from the passive person. The active person tends to communicate a lot in the sense of trying to be sure that things are going the way that person wants. But you're absolutely right. For the passive person, there won't be much communication. Now think about what Adler is saying. Adler is saying people have the potential to grow. So what else can go on in this relationship that would...
If the passive person starts to grow, and it becomes very uncomfortable and it won't work.
Yes. The thing about this kind of a marriage is when the ruling type person marries a passive person, it works as long as the passive person doesn't grow. But if the passive person begins to change and he or she begins to feel, I'm a person and I have aspirations and there are things that I would like to change, then all of a sudden we have a very different relationship. And as you could imagine, if the passive person does begin to grow, the ruling type person is extremely threatened. And that person begins to have all kinds of anxieties. And that's when you begin to get arguments. And that's also, it can be at the very point in which someone is really growing, you might even get to the point where you have the domestic violence that was mentioned. That is, if you can't control the person any other way, you may even get in the extreme to want to do so physically. Why? Because you're very frightened you're going to lose the person. Okay, now we're going to end this section, and in our next class we're going to go on and talk about the other types.